NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
I am really excited actually to be the kickoff panel on what is always a really phenomenal conference. I think this is now my 7th SCJN conference, and they've just been excellent every year. I'm here to moderate a panel that's entitled Disrupting Minority Report, How to Push Back on the Use of Predictive Analytics in Policing. And it is such that we are in a place where the movies and what things that are supposed to be non-reality are actually showing up as people's realities. And so when we're talking about the use of predictive analytics in policing, we're talking about a scenario in which police now have access to massive data sets about everything from where people live, how they move, what they do online, and they're able to take that and feed it into these algorithmic decision-making systems. And if that sounds sort of, some kind of sci-fi, it is kind of, and are using those to then instruct where they patrol, how they patrol, who they patrol and investigate, who they think may be either the victim of a crime or the perpetrator of a crime, and then acting on that. And this, of course, was a real concern to us at NACDL and how that might impact the way people are investigated, charged, and prosecuted and brought into the criminal legal system. And so a few years back, we put together a task force to look at what was then commonly called predictive policing. We have pushed the title to data-driven policing just because we find that companies often shift the nomenclature when something seems unpopular. They say we're doing precision policing, or we're just doing data analytics, or some other kind of language. So, we don't want to play the name game. We want to understand that if we want everyone to understand, we're talking about using these massive data sets, running them through these secret algorithms that are not transparent, and then making these decisions on who and where to police. And so we did put together a task force. We will be introducing a report in September, which is called Garbage In, Gospel Out: How Data-Driven Policing Technologies Entrench Historic Racism and Tech Wash Bias in the Criminal Legal System. You already have our recommendations. I believe they came through in the materials that were approved by the NACDL board in the fall. And, in case it's not obvious from the title, our top line recommendation is that these systems should not be used in policing, full stop. We do have then a series of recommendations that are intended to mitigate the fact that they are being used. And then in particular, defense counsel needs to understand how their client ended up in the system and what the factors were at play if they're going to be able to give them a fair shot at a defense. And so, we will be, please look forward in the future, we'll be announcing the date for the report launch, which should be in September. But for who we have today, and I think Monica's right, I always get to pull together some of the best panelists. We did, as the task force did, a number of meetings across the country. We went to Chicago, LA, San Francisco, New York City. We met in DC and spoke to people, all across the spectrum, everybody from law enforcement to companies to academics to defense lawyers to community advocates and, everybody in between. And the 3 people we'll be speaking to today either are with organizations that we spoke with or are people who spoke to our task force. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction and turn it over to them. I believe you have bios, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. But first, we're going to hear from Rahman, who is a lawyer in community organizing with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, who we did hear from in LA. He's also a practical fellow at the Civil Society Lab at Stanford. After that, we're going to hear from Chaselyn Hunt, who spoke to our task force when we were in Chicago, who's done Chicago, which was known for having their strategic suspects list, which was allegedly a list of, the people, again, who are at risk of becoming the victims or perpetrators of gun violence, and has engaged in many other forms of this data-driven policing. And Chaselyn is with the Youth and Police Project, Invisible Institute, and a civil rights attorney, and really gave our task force a lot of insight into how these systems impact youth. And then we're going to hear from Kevin Vogeltanz. And Kevin is an attorney out of New Orleans who stumbled one day upon in his case, the fact that Palantir, which is one of these companies, had been working with the New Orleans Police Department to do these kind of social mapping and gang databases that impact, that came up in his case, but was not known even to the city council at the time. So I'm very excited to hear from these 3 people. And we're going to start today with Shakir. So Shakir, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jamana, and hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for joining our panel and for attending. Yeah, and I'm excited to talk to you all. As Jumana said, I'm an attorney and a community organizer with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And before that, I previously worked at the Bronx Defender's Public Defender Office in New York. So, I've been to NACDL conferences in the past, and it's a real honor to speak at one. So I'm going to talk primarily about the LAPD's predictive policing programs, as well as the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition's fight against them. Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is a grassroots community organization formed about a decade ago. We're based in the Skid Row neighborhood of downtown Los Angeles. And we were a community group working to dismantle and abolish different forms of police surveillance, spying, and infiltration. And in the last several years, one of the coalition's big campaigns has been organizing against the different forms of LAPD's data-driven policing programs. As Jumana said, that's a term that kind of spans what has over time taken on a lot of different terminology. And in the past, it was called predictive policing, and that's how it was built. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of them, the evolution of the programs within LAPD, as well as kind of the evolution of the branding and how it's presented. But data-driven policing is kind of the broader what that evolution has been happening in. So the two programs that LAPD has sort of pioneered related to predictive policing, one was called Operation Laser and the other was called PredPol. And I'm going to talk about kind of both of them, what they were, what they did, as well as sort of who developed them and how they were built and kind of promoted, because I think sort of for thinking about how we really take these on, how we work to end their harm, how to dismantle them, it's important to think about that broader ecosystem of how these programs are emerging, so that we're not just kind of playing catch up with trying to think of kind of constitutional limits to them or what the kind of how to tolerate them, but really thinking about how these are being developed and what the how we confront that whole ecosystem to get to the root of a lot of these harms. So Operation Laser, the first program, Laser stands for Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration. It started in 2011, and even the name has been described as in kind of grant applications from LAPD as the goal is to like use laser-like precision to remove tumors from the community. And so referring to, the individuals who are targeted as tumors in that kind of dehumanizing language. So Operation Laser had both a location-based and an offender-based component. And so the person-based or offender-based was basically they created these kind of algorithmically generated or using data systems to generate these basically hit lists of who they deemed were chronic offenders. And so they were, and chronic offenders is their terminology, and the lists were called chronic offender bulletins, and they were generated basically using like a kind of point system. So if you were on parole or probation, that's 5 points. If you if you're designated a gang member, and that's, according to LAPD's labeling, and LAPD at the time, for a long time, had been participating in the Cal Gang statewide gang database that more recently LAPD was the Attorney General barred them from using it just because of falsification of information for it and falsification of the gang labels. So that's another point. You could also get a point for any quality police contact. So anytime police stop you for a traffic stop or a field stop and fill out these field interview cards, that's a point that gets you on the list. So there was that point system. And at the time, the end of when the program was finally dismantled in 2019, there were about 600 or 700 people on the list, but over 100 of them had no points. Even under the LAPD's own criteria, they had 0 points. They were just thrown on the list. And that, the list included children as young as 16, included lots of unhoused people, and was basically just, even with this cover of kind of we're using data, and the data was kind of crunched through Palantir system and kind of mined in that way. And I know Kevin is going to talk more about Palantir and I think in New Orleans and other places being used, but Operation Laser is built on that kind of Palantir architecture. So even though they had this kind of criteria, they're also just using it for the basic kind of racial profiling, abusive policing that LAPD has long been known for. And what happened with the program is once you're on the list, those lists circulate around LAPD, and special kind of gang units, narcotic units are tasked with coming to your door, kind of letting you know that they're always kind of harassing your neighbors, harassing people who know you, arresting you when they see you, pulling you over when they see you. And these were just kind of these secret lists that people were not notified they were on them. They were just targeted in this way and subject to kind of extreme policing and harassment. Stop LA Peace Spying Coalition has been, we basically sued LAPD to get lists of the names of everyone who was targeted through the program. And we've been starting to talk to them, and kind of the first thing everyone says is some version of, wow, yeah, I didn't know about this, but it all makes sense now. Police were, constantly harassing me and breaking into my home, terrorizing my family, arresting me every time they would see me. And police even, people are telling us police told them that they wouldn't rest until they removed me from here for good. And a lot of people were forced to leave their neighborhoods or move. And a lot of people, wound up incarcerated. And just, I want to bring up that toll because it's sort of, you can't measure that harm. And it's hard to also kind of think about that narrowly, like solely in the confines of a criminal case, because those are just kind of the harms of just policing, investigation, and surveillance, not always, happening through prosecution and a conviction, though, of course, a lot of times, once you harass someone enough and go after them enough, the police are going to get a case to stick, or a lot of people who are on parole or probation, you're going to get violations to stick. You're going to get someone stepped in. So that's the offender-based component, the person-based. And then there was also this location-based, which basically mines police data to designate kind of locations for hyper-policing, locations where they expect crime to happen in the future. So under Operation Laser, these were called laser zones. They also had these anchor points that was their terminology for the points that they would target. And these programs, I want to highlight that they were, not just used for policing, like directly kind of, police enforcement and activity, but also we've found through Public Records Act requests that they were operated in coordination with, for example, our municipal prosecutor in LA, the city attorney's nuisance abatement program. So those are civil nuisance abatement. They're basically, they target a building, declare it a nuisance, and then can pressure a landlord to make changes to the building, like installing surveillance or evicting tenants who they deem a nuisance. So that's another way that this program, we need to think about it beyond just what's happening in court and what's happening in prosecutions, but also kind of more broadly the role of these other kinds of consequences and other agencies, and the way that really these data-driven programs allow for a more kind of seamless and ultimately dangerous coordination between different agencies, as well as through the nuisance abatement program, kind of like the data points that are coming into that program are often coming from complaints from developers or from others who have the ear of the city attorney. And so these programs allow for this kind of veneer of data science and objectivity for what's often, coordination and collusion between those different, like kind of entities that are, maybe working to gentrify a neighborhood or displace people. So Laser, as I said, was built within LAPD. It was kind of a homegrown internal program built on Palantir infrastructure. And one of the kind of architects, of the person who ran it, was this person named Craig Uchida, who runs a kind of police consulting business in Maryland, and for many years before that was one of the at the US DOJ in charge of directing COPS funding, the community-oriented police. What is it? Police Services Program. It's like their kind of community policing grants that come out of the 1994 crime bill. And so this program was kind of designed very much with DOJ support. And a lot of the grants for these kinds of programs come from like sort of the DOJ, like innovation grants, like burn grants, COPS grants, As well as, I mean, in LA, a lot of the more recent funding for Palantir to the city has come from Department of Homeland Security Urban Area Security Initiative grants. As well as originally when LAPD first started using Palantir, it actually was a donation through the Police Foundation from Target, the retailer. That at the time, the police chief, Bill Bratton, asked Target to donate money so LAPD could buy Palantir and started using it in that way. And then over the years, developed these programs. So I bring just all of those up as kind of thinking about the landscape of how these programs are coming to different cities, how they're being funded. And that includes, obviously, yeah, all these federal funding grants, as well as often, yeah, private corporations subsidizing, new tools for police. So that's Operation Laser. The other program that LAPD has used is called PredPol. So PredPol, which stands for Predictive Policing, is a for-profit company that was founded by a couple of UCLA professors, an anthropologist and an applied math professor, and they basically kind of wrote these algorithms, again, that based for predicting. It was also kind of location based for predicting hotspots and locations where crime was going to occur. And so the algorithms they developed, and they actually tested them with LAPD. They did kind of a randomized controlled trial to test them here. And then the company's founders published that research in academic journals, and then used that research to then sell the product around the country. And UCLA actually also owns a corporate stake in the program, or in the company. So continues to profit off of it. And so again, that kind of landscape of academic researchers often kind of helping push these technologies. The research that they published in collaboration with LAPD talked about based on these randomized controlled trials, kind of, it's reducing crime and it's having these effects. They later on an audit that the Inspector General for LAPD conducted concluded that no, that those results don't hold up, and there's kind of no evidence of any kind of impact on crime or anything like that. So those are the programs, and LAPD is no longer using both of them. As I said, they stopped using Operation Laser in 2019, and they stopped using PredPol in 2020. But what I'm going to talk about next is kind of the evolution of these programs, and kind of thinking about that from the perspective of on the one hand, reform of them, and on the other hand, kind of what it looks like to abolish them, or to kind of address them from an abolitionist perspective, committed to ending altogether the harm of policing by abolishing policing and surveillance. So when I talk about reform, what I'm talking about is kind of a process that even the emergence of these predictive policing programs we need to think of as these programs originated in reform, that the practices that they build on are basically, it's kind of automating or providing this veneer of data science to what was previously just racial profiling. It was just stop and frisk. It was broken windows policing. It was this kind of aggressive targeting and kind of proactive, speculative policing of predominantly Black and brown communities. Those same practices are continuing in Los Angeles. They were just now done through this idea of, okay, we're using technology and we're using data. And in fact, when Operation Laser first emerged, it was very much promoted by kind of national criminal justice reform organizations as a reform that cities everywhere should adopt. The Vera Institute, which is this kind of national advocacy and reform nonprofit that is very active in Los Angeles and New York and New Orleans and other places, in 2014 published a report with the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Assistance talking about predictive policing as this new paradigm that police everywhere should adopt, and specifically even it had like a couple pages on Operation Laser as like an exemplary form of this, and that this is an example of what they call crime analysis, and they use the term predictive policing that police should adopt, and it's going to make them more efficient, and there's funding available for it, and that kind of thing. So it's promoted by entities like Vera, and then later on, as in Los Angeles, as the community is fighting to dismantle and speaking out against Predpol, Operation Laser and Predpol, LAPD then points to, they literally referred to this report from Vera as kind of cover for saying, no, this is actually like a, well promoted and accepted and applauded program by these reform nonprofits. So that's kind of a way that that reform has been crucial to how these programs developed. And now fast forwarding to now, as in Los Angeles, as the community discredited these programs and exposed their harm and fought to dismantle them. Once this notion of predictive and as kind of captured in the title of this panel, this kind of idea of minority report, and this kind of there's an aversion that people have to that the community was able to develop and push back. Once that notion of predictive was discredited, LAPD basically began just kind of rebranding their programs using now the latest kind of reform concepts. So literally the same month that LAPD ended Predpol, April 2020, later that same month, they announced what they call data-informed community-focused policing. That's basically, it's like their new kind of paradigm of how they're going to use data mining and their new form of data-driven policing. And let me just show quickly this. So this is the report that they announced, released, kind of describing this new framework. And if you look at it, it now talks about how before, they were in this business of predictive policing, but now they will continue to implement systems that the goal is to measure results, improve efficiency, and provide overall accountability. So those same programs are now being kind of recast as all about accountability, as well as in the title, community policing. So it's the same systems, it's still the same surveillance and data inputs. It's still the same Palantir data infrastructure that's mining it. And it's the same outputs in terms of what police are doing in terms of proactively policing, going to people's houses, arrests, all of that. It's just a new kind of reformist veneer for them. And that, doesn't come out of nowhere. That comes from people who are calling for the response to these programs being, oh, we need to make them more accountable. We need to make them more responsive to the community. Of course, in Los Angeles, like the community that was fighting back against predictive policing and exposing its harm and working to dismantle and organizing against it, we're not asking for, combining these programs with accountability and using data to measure police efficiency or accountability. They were asking for they're demanding that these programs be dismantled. They're working to abolish them. But these things exist in a broader ecosystem that kind of is part of that evolution. Predpol too changed its name, and this, as Jumana was saying, a lot of these programs are literally just kind of changing their names. And I want to show here. So this is literally, if you just see, this is like the Predpol's website. It says predict critical events, gain insight, the Predictive Policing Company trademark. But you go here, they changed their name. And literally what they've done, they've just replaced where it used to say the Predictive Policing Company with, we run operations for public safety teams to be more transparent, accountable, and effective. So again, it's just taking these kind of same programs, same inputs, same harm, and just kind of using the latest language of reform, the latest kind of concepts of reformist concepts to change them. And that's, that's just the kind of evolution of policing over time, that the whole kind of, police state that y'all are working to protect your clients from is evolving in this way through reform, through kind of legal tinkering with it, rather than even, often it's a lot easier for police to work, obviously, with people who are simply seeking to reform their practices rather than communities that are working to organize to abolish and dismantle them. So I'm going to just finish by talking about so how, what that fight back against these programs has looked like in LA, and and how the Stop LAP Spying as a coalition has approached them and how we should be thinking about them. And I mean, as you can probably guess, I mean, I think my answer to how we fight back is community organizing. It's building kind of community power to create a crisis for these programs. It's building community expertise and understanding of them, rather than this kind of just these programs being things that are only talked about in the kind of legal advocacy space, or thinking about them only kind of in the legal or kind of policy, that kind of more professional space. It's to really build grassroots expertise and knowledge around them. Because I mean, trying to just find kind of the, like, especially like constitutional and legal limits for the kinds of programs that I've been describing is a fool's errand. There are some things, obviously, like the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment, and some, I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of legal limits, but for the most part, it's
Shakir, can we save some of maybe the constitutional pieces for questions? Because I want to make sure that we get to all of our panelists.
Okay, totally. Sorry, I just saw your chat. I missed it. Okay, so maybe just the last thing I'm going to say is that putting aside all the constitutional stuff, like that. All of this is based on police collecting, storing, harvesting data. So we need to think about, if, like, when we're attacking data-driven policing, calling it data-driven policing, what's a perspective of, like, why are police even holding on to all this data and able to use it? And there's solutions. And some states kind of have these laws that require sealing or expungement of police data, so it can't be recycled in these systems. And so that kind of thinking about, and we'll come back to this later, is sort of, how do we get rid of the data in the first place so police can't be continuing to use it, rather than just trying to place sort of limits on it? And sorry, I went over time.
No worries. It was a lot to cover, and I think you did a pretty phenomenal job of taking it on and encapsulating it. And so I want to turn it over to Chaselyn. We had a lot of questions on how this not just impacted people generally, but obviously, children in the criminal legal system are supposed to have, particular protections. They're supposed to have records expunged and the ability to have, records sealed and all of those things that, we had questions on how does that show up in these contexts. And we found Chaselyn to be really illuminating when we heard from her. So Chaselyn, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Shakir. I really agree with what you said just off the bat about the fact that this is just a continuation. So for my kids, it doesn't really look like new over policing. It just looks like over policing for different reasons, and the legitimacy that data science brings to it. So my name is Chaselyn Hunt. I work at the Invisible Institute. We are a nonprofit investigative journalism organization. So primarily what we do is investigate human rights abuses, and in Chicago, really focused on the Chicago Police Department. I work a little bit as an attorney within the organization, mostly on First Amendment stuff, not really criminal. And then I run a project called the Youth Police Project, where we work with high school kids, mostly Black, mostly on the South Side, but a little variation across the city, talking about their encounters with the police and really just spending the time it takes to understand what it means for them to be interacting daily with officers, what these sort of high-level policies look like when they're on the ground. And as our kids get older, we stay with them. We get to know them over the years. And so as they get older, they get more involved with the criminal justice system. And so we do a lot of court support. We show up with kids, we write letters talking about their character, things like that. So that's really our relationship with our young people. And so this idea actually of predictive policing became of interest to us for two sort of simultaneous reasons. One is that we work right by the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago has a wing called the Crime Lab. And the Crime Lab is a private academic research lab. It contracts with the police department. It gets access to police information. It evaluates programs, provides reports back. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this model. And we just found it like abhorrent that the crime lab was legitimizing policing tactics that were pretty clearly putting our kids in more and more danger. And then also they're not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests in a large way. There's another lab like that now in Chicago called N3, run out of Northwestern. And this type of model, the Youth Police Project takes a lot of lessons from sociology and anthropology in terms of recording how we exist with the kids, taking notes, taking videos during interviews, But within this long tradition of academic research of young people, there is this like alternate side, which is profiting off of their involvement in the criminal justice system. And the more data you have to work with, and the more kids you have to analyze, and the more contracts you get with the police department, and the more you legitimize their policies, the more they come back to you. Like, it's just a really ugly system. And it's a big problem, because they often talk about this work as like risk prediction, prediction of kids who are likely to be shot or the victims of violent crime. And they put it in a sort of public health model, which makes it a little bit objective. They talk about like epidemics of violence and how they spread, and social networking analysis. And all of this is sort of like removes itself from the really ugly harm of taking a young person who would otherwise not interact with a police officer, and not only putting them in that interaction, but telling the police officer this kid is likely to be dangerous. The kid you're interacting with is not just someone you've encountered on the street. They're like dangerous, or they might be in harm's way. They need the police more than another person needs the police. Like, that escalates situations. And I was recently, the 13-year-old who was murdered by the Chicago Police Department, Adam Toledo. If you don't know that case, please look it up. The police arrived hot to that scene. That's what we call it. They came on the scene hot because they had information from ShotSpotter, which is like a big microphone essentially, or a big recorder that on a giant pole, and it listens to the neighborhood. And if it hears a gunshot, it sends a report right to the police department. Those officers were told there was a gunshot, and they came on the scene really hot. And I think that type of escalation is, like, in that moment, a very good representation of the way it can happen, sort of like more calmly, when an officer pulls up on a kid and actually has in their car a list of information. And this was happening for a long time, not just like the person's arrests, but like their social network, potential connections, not themselves to gangs, but to family members who might have been identified by the police as in gangs. Information about where they go to school and school disciplinary, information about their social network, like what usernames do they have, what nicknames do they go by on social media. And it's like a whole set of information that tells the cop this kid is bad. This kid needs police more than other people. And so we just find that over and over again, when a kid is brought into the criminal justice system under these circumstances, it becomes much more difficult to convince a judge that they are worthy of not being thrown in jail on their first arrest. Like, it seems so basic, but so many of the letters we write are to fill out the profile of our student, to say, like, you know, he's not just his suspension in school and this misdemeanor arrest. He actually plays sports, he films videos, he does delivery driving for mutual aid efforts on the side, like, just to give the judge all this information that's not about the violence that the student might bring into the life of the community. So I'd say that's where it really came from. The other part of that is knowing that our students who live in rough neighborhoods, or who live in neighborhoods where they might feel something dangerous might happen to them, they were moving more and more of their lives online. And specifically, we saw grief. And this has been totally exacerbated by the pandemic. But if someone you love is shot and killed, and it potentially is a dangerous situation, and you feel that you can't go to their funeral, or you can't cross certain boundaries in the city to go to that funeral, then the kids were expressing their grief online. Like, rest in peace, my cousin, prayer hand emojis, putting Facebook statuses about it. Other kids were responding. Creation of a real community where your physical safety is not at danger and you can express yourself. They were doing social media monitoring, looking for words like rest in peace. They're looking, and like Forrest Stewart, who was an academic at the University of Chicago at the time, had a very good critique of the way that we're allowing police and criminal justice systems to literally like monitor the kids' grief and then turn that into data about gang action, potential violence, etc. And that's just, like, hear me upset a little bit, because I think it's absolutely, it's like a terrible, it's indefensible that you would take a child's grief and their expression of it and turn it into criminal justice data. So that's kind of our perspective on it. I really do think that this element of data science is very difficult. And I think that there are data scientists who work on social networking analysis, who participate in the sort of criminal justice network analysis, that should be held accountable for what they're doing, should be asked publicly. And I think this is an element that we're thinking about with our kids, which is like, if the data that the police department was using to interact with this kid, to stop them, to arrest them, et cetera, if that data came from an algorithm that was initially developed by a data scientist, like, why is that data scientist also not responsible for dispelling whatever the algorithm has done wrong? Like, where are my data scientists who come to criminal trials and speak on behalf of a defendant who's been treated improperly by the algorithm? Because in Chicago, the strategic subject list is like big project. Recently, our inspector general analyzed it and said, no, you have to stop. It's like pretty clearly unconstitutional. And the police department's response was, okay, so they're going to stop it. The main critiques were just like, it's not being used appropriately. Like, the data coming in is not accurate. You're putting too much stuff in there that doesn't belong there. You're giving cops access to stuff they shouldn't have access to. Like, it's not some like high-powered, perfect system that's just like churning out information. It's just like a bad system. Cops are using it to do the same things they were doing before. And I want to know, like, where is the accountability for the data scientist who can say the police department used this inappropriately on this child? Like, get my kids out of these trials if your data and your analysis has put them in this situation. So sometimes I can work myself up. I apologize, but for me, there's an element of accountability that needs to happen, both from how police officers have used off of this information and really using it to understand, like, data is not going anywhere. We're not going to stop collecting data, but what are the limits of it when it comes to incarcerating a young person? And what are some ways we could use it to get kids out of the criminal justice system, as opposed to into it? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chaselyn. And I'm feeling like you all figured out why, speaking with these folks so far was really, really critical and useful to us as we were considering NACDL's position and working up this report. So I want to turn it over to Kevin Vogeltanz. I think one of the hardest things for a defense lawyer is to know, because these things aren't usually advertised in ways that make it very easy to know that that's why this particular person was stopped or searched or had their house searched or whatever. And I think that goes back to what Shakir was saying when they started going through the list of people who were saying, oh, this makes sense now. And so, Kevin actually found out in his case, almost by accident, or that his client was actually part of the social mapping. So I'm excited to have you all hear from him. It's fairly unusual to be able to find out, as it's not something that is usually advertised by the prosecution or law enforcement. So Kevin, I'm happy to turn it to you.
And just so I know, Jamana, how much time do I have? My name is Kevin Vogeltanz. I'm a litigator here in the New Orleans area. And I started off kind of at a big defense firm. I started my own practice. And at first I had kind of a general civil and criminal defense practice. And then over time, I've really migrated over to federal employment law. I represent plaintiffs, employment discrimination victims, things like that. But there was a time in which I did a lot of criminal defense. And I was court appointed in a case that began in New Orleans in 2013. And the local district attorney indicted 20 people who were allegedly part of what is known in Louisiana as a criminal street gang. And they used Louisiana state analog of the Federal Racketeering Act to try to sweep up a lot of people and to allege that they were engaged in racketeering. So it wasn't, necessary to prove, individual kind of acts of violence against or drug trafficking or money laundering or whatnot against individual people if they could prove that they were part of a racketeering conspiracy. in any event, most of these people were not Amines, and so there was a lot of conflicts with the local public defender's office. I was court appointed to represent the only person that actually ended up going to trial. Everybody else pled out over time. And that person's name was Kentrell Hickerson. And so only just recently have I stopped representing Mr. Hickerson in that case. But the long and the short of it was we had a trial. He was charged on 3 counts. He was found not guilty of 1 count. He was found non-unanimously guilty of 1 count, and he was found unanimously guilty on the last count. And anybody that kind of has paid attention knows that we had non-unanimous convictions in Louisiana for a time, not anymore, and legislatively and because of the Supreme Court. Anyway, we filed post-trial motions for a new trial and based on Brady and non-Brady issues. And about a week before we were going to have a hearing on this in 2018, there was an investigative journalist named Ollie Winston who wrote for The Verge. I'm going to post a link to that article when I'm done talking here in the chat so you can read it if you want. And he revealed through his investigative journalism that the city of New Orleans mayor's office had secretly contracted with a group called Palantir out of California to deploy this kind of analytical suite called Gotham, and that NOPD and something called the Multi-Agency Gang Unit, which was an amalgam of federal and state law enforcement and prosecuting partners that were based out of New Orleans, were using Palantir to generate, hundreds, thousands, we don't really know, of what they call social networking graphs that were being fed by kind of data that was being scraped and digitized from law enforcement entities down here to try to inform prosecutors and investigators and law enforcement people about gang connections, racketeering connections, to provide intelligence and investigations, things like that. And Mr. Winston was able to get on the record some pretty high-ranking people from New Orleans law enforcement who had retired at the time, and they specifically named the alleged gang in my case, which was called the Third and Galvez gang, as perpetrators. And I don't want to waste all my time. So the most important thing is I was able to go into court and using subpoenas try to gather information whether or not my client was named in one of these social networking graphs or not. I'm going to share my screen with you right now to kind of show from a practitioner perspective what the city of New Orleans was using at the time. And so we're going to see if this works here. Okay. And we have the social networking graph, and this is kind of the work product that was being generated on a daily basis. Essentially, anytime there was a shooting crime in New Orleans, some data scientists were told to go into Palantir and using all of the information that they had to basically construct these social networking graphs. And when you construct them, what happens is you take a person or an event, and that's kind of your seed, and then you just tell Palantir or Gotham to kind of start producing these social networking graphs. This is an actual graph from a real case that was produced for me by the city. Kind of, well, it's a long story, but these icons mean different things. The person icon means that that's a real life arrestee or defendant or person who's been convicted of a crime. And then all of these other little icons represent different data points that law enforcement agencies have collected. So maybe they're police reports, maybe they're kind of field investigation cards, maybe they're ballistic or forensic reports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What you can see is that for any, and these lines connect different crimes or pieces of data to different people. And so what law enforcement was doing was they were trying to show for these shooting crimes, well, what do we know about, what's every single thing that we know visually about this person who is either a victim or an alleged perpetrator of the crime? And then they would send this material out to an entire long list of kind of investigators and prosecutors, and then that would inform kind of their choices. Now, it turns out that in reality, I was never allowed to get or to find out whether or not my client name appeared in any of these documents, because eventually we found out that the city of New Orleans itself was the custodian of these records. And they probably did that for some strategic, trial litigation reasons, if it ever came up. And they took the position that they did not have the ability to search these thousands of Palantir social networking graphs. It would be too difficult and time intensive to kind of review them all. And for that reason, the court granted a motion from them to kind of quash any further attempts of mine to investigate it. So today, we still don't really know, and we'll probably never know with Mr. Hickerson whether or not any of his he ever came up with any of these graphs. And I see that I'm already kind of at the end of my time. But from a practitioner perspective, what I would encourage everybody.
We did get a small reprieve, so please continue.
Well, what I would encourage everybody to think about from a practitioner perspective, a criminal defense perspective, is anytime that you know that a local law enforcement agency is or may be using kind of these analytical suites, there's, I think, a great pressure on us just in the way that we kind of view these items to think about, I need this information because I need to understand, if it's implicating my client or not, and I have to be able to cross-examine, and there's kind of Washington direct, confrontation clause issues. I would encourage you to flip it and think about it in the opposite way, because in my mind, all of these analytical programs that are spitting out hundreds, thousands, millions of data points against potential or actual defendants, these are, in my mind, giant Brady evidence generating machines. And I think that there is a way that we could use them to really benefit our clients in terms of criminal defense. Because if you go back to that kind of social networking graph that I showed, there's all these people that are populated on the map that are related to any other person or any other potential crime. That's information that would not necessarily ever be shared with a criminal defense lawyer in terms of litigation or discovery. It's not something that maybe even the detective would even be, cognizant of or have even relied upon when they were kind of doing their investigation. But what does that show us as practitioners? It shows us the names and the identities and the dates and the times and the circumstances of other potential suspects that, according to an algorithm or according to all the data that has been collected and generated by the local law enforcement agency, had potentially the opportunity, the motive, the means, or the time to be affiliated with this crime. And if your client's name is not at the center of the graph, or if they're not on the graph at all, well, that's great evidence that, at least according to the information that law enforcement has collected, maybe it's not likely that your client was actually involved with this crime. Maybe it's far more likely that someone that's closer to the center of the graph, or other people that are on the graph, are people that may have participated in the crime. At least from a Brady perspective, that's information that I think has to be given over to defense lawyers. And I think that that is the fundamental reason why these law enforcement agencies so desperately try to keep this information proprietary and secret, because they know that if it was possible or convenient for defense lawyers to kind of scan this information, that would actually be put prosecution in a very difficult position, because now they'd essentially be forced to share this kind of intelligence or analytics with the criminal defense bar case by case. And that's obviously not something that they want to do. In the city of New Orleans, they eventually stopped using Palantir after this report broke. It did come out that the mayor's office had kind of secretly signed this contract. He did not let the city council know. If you can even believe it, this was actually like an idea that was hatched between our former mayor at the time, Mitch Landrieu, and a political pundit named James Carville on a plane. And that he got them in contact with Palantir. And then if anybody's interested in Mr. Hickerson, we got one of his other convictions overturned on appellate review. He's not quite done exhausting all of his appeals. So he's down to just one conviction from the original three. And a good colleague of mine is still working for Mr. Hickerson. If I could end on one thing, it is this: the Palantir company, they are, I don't know, they seem like they're really kind of far out there in terms of firm culture and everything. I would like to share with everybody that the word Palantir, where does that come from? Any fantasy people, Lord of the Rings people. Palantir is the name of a magical orb in the Lord of the Rings stories, which allows someone to kind of see events all over the world. That's why the company chose the name. But, you know, a favorite expression of mine is it's always funny how people tell on themselves. In the books, Palantir, the Palantirs were dangerous to use because if you didn't have sufficient will, if you weren't disciplined enough, the Palantirs were unreliable, and they would show you things that maybe were in the past or the future you didn't realize. Maybe they would show you a small aspect of what was going on, but not the bigger picture, and you would make bad decisions based on, you know, what it was showing you. It could be controlled by other people who had a stronger will. And I think that's very, you know, analogous to how law enforcement agencies and even Palantir itself are probably using these data suites. You know, they think that this is going to give them all this information, but in reality, if you don't have the complete picture, or if you don't have a sufficient mastery of it, or if you're not using it for the correct purposes, you get these distorted views of things that are probably not really helpful at all, and are probably harmful. So that's from a practitioner perspective. If we had known earlier on about this, we probably could have done a lot more with it. And if anybody has any questions in their own cases, real life cases, you can contact me after the seminar. We can kind of talk more about it. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Kevin. And yes, they are pretty out there. My understanding is in their main headquarters, they're like central areas called the Shire, because they're really bought into their.
It's true. That's true.
Yeah. So, so we have like maybe 3 minutes left for questions. I just wanted to mention that we are going to put ways to contact people in the chat. Also, I see in the chat there is our 4ac@nacdl.org email. If you are a practitioner and you have not just something maybe about predictive policing, but any kind of tech that is showing up in your case, we have materials. We can help talk you through it. We can help answer questions, and we do sometimes help people litigate on cases where you're dealing with tech in the criminal legal system. So please contact us at 4ac@nacdl.org. I'm going to do a quick thank you to Kevin, Chaselyn, and Shakir, who I think have taken this massive issue and really sort of boiled it down in an impactful and informative way for all of you. One question, and any of you can jump in on this, that we did get: is Palantir's contracts with law enforcement publicly available since they're listed on NYSE, or are they private? We just heard from Candace, they can be totally unknown. It depends on how they get there. But if somebody wants to throw a quick answer in, or I can fill in if not. Does someone want to jump in?
Well, I can share. I don't know about it on the corporate side, but at least on the public records side, I mean, we've been able to get a lot of the contracts in LA through public records laws, as well as I mean, some cities have portals that they have to publish all their payment data as well as that. So yeah, maybe from the municipal side through open records, FOIA type laws. Yeah,
and I think that the difficulty is in some places Palantir will come in and give the product for free, for people to try out. And when they do something like that, there is no public record to access, and it's not subject to the same kinds of restrictions. And so in that sense, it can certainly be hidden. We did get another question from a data scientist who works with North Carolina Indigent Defense Services, who is asking about legal issues using characteristics that might be protected classes like gender, sex, ethnicity, race in these types of algorithms. Does anybody have a thought on that? I know we've got like 1 minute, so this may be a difficult one to answer, but again, I'll point you to the chat. Everybody's contact information is there as well. Chaselyn?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Not obviously, but nobody claims to use those characteristics in their algorithm. Everyone says like, we would never, those are protected classes, obviously. But I think like a lot of what they're relying on is stuff that was racist to begin with. Like, if what you're relying on is arrest records, and who gets arrested are young Black men by cops because of all the sorts of bias we know about them, then the bias continues. In terms of an argument to remove that, I think it's really difficult. I'd like to see more interest in some sort of like class action type stuff that just shows like statistically this stuff is biased, but that's just I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have other stuff.
All right, so I know we're wrapping this up very quickly. I want to thank again all of our panelists for this phenomenal panel. Monica says I do this really well. I always look good because I've got really great people on our panels. Again, there's materials in the chat. There's contact in the chat. Thanks very much for joining us for this panel.